my name is John and I'm the founder of Beats Academy, and today I'll be going through the ins and outs of the NAPLAN exam, which is the nationwide exam that all students here in Australia need to take. Let's get into it. As my team and I only do one-on-one private classes, oftentimes we have to tailor our lessons to the individual goals for our students. And sometimes the NAPLAN is one of our primary focus. But what is it in the first place? So the NAPLAN exam stands for the National Assessment Program for Literacy and Numeracy, which actually stands for NAPLAN, all in capital letters. And it's actually an exam that was already existed for the last 10 or so years, starting in 2008. However, with the various new changes to the NAPLAN exam, with it now being online and their goal to make it online for all schools by the end of next year, I think it's quite significant, especially because a lot of parents are still inquiring, why is it important in the first place? Should we be preparing for it? And how can we use this information in the future? So I'll be going over those concerns on top of the backstory and the history of it and my personal interpretation on why the NAPLAN exams is so useful in seeing if your child is performing to the level that they need to perform. In terms of background, the exam first began from a meeting from NSW, which is a national organization who provides a lot of evaluations from an educational point of view on the landscape on how education should be adapted and catered towards the new landscape that we have today. So essentially, they recognized that they needed to see if students were actually performing to the national benchmark level or the national minimum standards across numeracy, literacy, reading comprehension, and writing. They know this by allocating each student in an actual band, and if you're in a certain band in a certain year, then we know whether you're performing at or above or even below the national minimum standard. This is quite significant because students in year 3, for instance, will have different bands compared to students in year 5. And on top of that, even if you have the same band, you're not necessarily being compared to a year 3 student being compared to a year 5 student. The NAPLAN also aligns with the national schooling system here in Australia, which has recently become a focal area and a point of natural interest, where they recognize that if the local talent and the local students here from an educational point of view falls behind and we aren't able to compete with the other countries all around the world, this is going to be a huge catastrophe in the future. So this is why we actually implemented this exam, to sort of see how students are performing from a grassroots local level here in Australia. This note is also supported and reinforced by ACARA, who actually creates these NAPLAN exams, where they said that they have these literacy and numeracy exams to test students whether they will be readily prepared for life beyond schooling years. So after the HSC, after going to year 12 or year 10, wherever you have to go, will you be ready to go into a full-time job and be a part of the workforce, or will you have a lot of trouble in actually assimilating into that and integrating with society beyond school? If that is going to be the case, that is why the NAPLAN exam is important, because it helps us realize that, hey, if you actually leave school early now, from a numeracy point of view, you're going to be falling behind, and it's going to be quite tough for you to gain willful employment in that sense. The information is also valuable from a schools and educational perspective, where schools can also see if what they're teaching in terms of the curriculum and the syllabus inside the day-to-day school life with actual students, with their teachers, is actually reflected in increased marks in the NAPLAN exam. Or alternatively, is it having a negative effect? So if the syllabus or curriculum needs changing and the NAPLAN scores are actually going down or aren't increasing year on year, then they know that something needs to be changed from the school level. It's also very beneficial for students and parents alike as well, because they will actually be able to see if their child or the student is actually performing at or above the national average. This is important because the school report is quite valuable in giving that type of information. However, if you go to a really good school or if you go to a really not so good school, from a ranking point of view, this can actually give you skewed results. So the reason why the NAPLAN exam is so good is because every single school and every single student in Australia has to complete this exam. That gives you a lot larger sample size, so you might get a B in English in your school report, but from a NAPLAN point of view, you might still be at the highest band because of the level of caliber of students that are currently attending your school, or vice versa. You might get a B in your school report and you might think, hey, I'm doing pretty good, but you actually go below the national average. However, ultimately, the test has shown that it has been quite useful in these areas that I just mentioned. And a testament to it is that it has been running for 12 years now and has recently changed to an online adaptive model, which has been quite useful for both parents, students, and teachers alike, so that they can get more information and it's actually easier for them to actually implement the exam too. I'm now going to go over an analysis of the NAPLAN exam. So essentially, the NAPLAN exam is a point-in-time assessment that allows parents to know how the child is performing against national standards across literacy and numeracy. It provides schools, states, and territories with information on whether their approaches to education is working to the standards that's needed, the areas that still need to be improved, as well as which schools in certain states and territories need that extra push and support. One thing to note here is that since NAPLAN is just a one-time test done during May, essentially this is not going to be a complete and true reflection of their ability, but their ability during this point in time. So this is something to take into consideration, as the students will likely have a better picture on their performance if they actually spoke to the actual teacher, because the teacher will be the one who will, on a day-to-day basis, be seeing how the child is performing and if they're performing to the standard or below the standard accordingly. But the NAPLAN exam is very useful information to help supplement this information on top of the teacher's feedback too. This is also reflected on the NAPLAN site as well, which shows that the teacher will actually have the best indication on how a particular student is performing. However, I also think that a teacher is also another source of information on top of something that you can pull. So in order for me to see whether a student is performing to the standards that's needed, I actually reach out to the NAPLAN exams, compared to the state, how they're performing, which bands are they getting across each subject, talk to the teacher. The teacher's feedback is invaluable and I'm not degrading that at all. I think it's very important and to take that in consideration if they're performing from a concentration point of view and whether they are understanding the things that are needed in terms of a syllabus point of view as well. But I'll also be getting them to do tests on top of that as well, just to sort of see, okay, so in NAPLAN, it tests certain benchmarks across the state, but what if we give them another test like the ICAS exam, or whether they are able to go for the OC class or even for the selective school test, just to sort of see how they rank from an upper level point of view. I'll also use their school report, how many A's, B's, C's. Every school has different bands and different scaling and grading systems, so that will kind of change, but generally it will be an ABC system, so the more A's you have, the better. B's and C's. On top of that as well, if they have a tutor, I'll be speaking to the tutor and really narrowing down specifically how their point of view is in regards to a child's learning and whether they are able to focus on the weaker areas as opposed to going and touching all the entire foundations of what a normal primary school or even a high school teacher usually does inside normal group lessons. Although something to note here is that I think the NAPLAN exam is probably the most objective point of view, because that everyone in the entire state has to complete the exam, as opposed to the OC or selective where you have to self-elect yourself to actually complete these exams. And certain states and territories, in terms of the OC and selective, they might not even offer it. Although, especially in the test in year 3 and year 5, you might not see a real world application in terms of answering the questions that are actually tested in the NAPLAN exam. I think the overall principles and the concepts are quite basic and are testing the foundations, where if you can't spell certain words, or if you can't do one or even 2 syllable words in terms of sounding it out, it will have pretty big consequences when you go outside into the workforce or when you finish your schooling, because you can't actually spell or even sound out some basic or relatively simple words. I will now go over the results side of things. So every test is actually done in terms of bands, so not levels, it's not scores, it's actually from bands. And specifically in year 3, when you do it, the bands range from 1 to 6. In year 5, it ranges from 3 to 8. Year 7, it ranges from 4 to 9. And lastly, students in year 9, it ranges from 5 to 10. So like I said, the students who actually complete the exam is only in year 3, 5, 7, and 9 every 2 years. And the reason why they do this is because they find that 1 year is sometimes not enough for them to actually see enough improvement. So instead of testing in year 3 and then year 4 again, they just test it every 2 years, so year 3 and year 5. It's also a bit easier from a logistical point of view as well. If everyone in the actual school had to do this exam every single year, then during that period of time that a lot of students can't actually fit in the hall to actually complete that exam, and it's a bit of a mess there. Is it actually difficult for students to get the national minimum standard? To be honest, not really. I don't know many students who actually struggle to achieve it. To be honest, you only need to get about 10% in the actual exam to get that national minimum standard, which is why I don't use that as the benchmark. The school uses that. Instead, what I actually like doing from a more objective point of view is that I like to test from a national average. So in terms of national average, you actually get a mark. It might be in the middle of the band. So in terms of in year 3, from bands 1 to 6, the minimum band will be 2, but the national average could be 4, for instance. Therefore, your goal as parents and students is not to get the national minimum standard and get above that. You want to get a lot higher than the national average, especially if you are looking to get ahead or going into a private school or even a school that is a little bit more accelerated from an academic point of view. The exam report is also usually delivered in September, with the test being in May. The significance of this is that if you do the test in May and you bomb out and you don't do very well, you may actually be improving from the months from May to September. And when you actually get the results in September, that doesn't take into consideration a couple of months that you may have improved. In saying that, you could have also not improved and gotten worse over that time. So like I said, the NAPLAN exam is a point-in-time assessment. So it's not going to be perfect unless you'll be doing a test every single month, which is not logistically viable at all. So you've got to take that in consideration when you are evaluating the results too. On top of that, when you actually complete the exam in May, it doesn't take into consideration any external factors that may have resulted in your score. So if you were really in the zone and really focused, you may have gotten a better mark than if you were just going in a normal state, as opposed to if you were really stressed because of family situation and you couldn't concentrate in the actual exam. You don't actually get your marks scaled up or anything like that. It's a test only at that point in time. This is why I urge using the NAPLAN as part of the focus area to sort of see if your child or student is performing to the level that they really need to. So personally, I help a lot of students get into OC classes as well as selective schools here in New South Wales. And typically, if you're not in the top band or even the top 2 bands in NAPLAN, then I already know from a broad point of view that you probably won't be getting into a selective school. Now I'm going to go over NAPLAN Online. So essentially, NAPLAN Online actually gives a lot of schools more flexibility in regards to how they could administer exams, as opposed to making it all paper-based, making sure that it's all shipped and allocated. Since the tests are now online, they just have to get access to a device with access to the internet, and essentially you just do the exams that way. So for students in year 3, however, the writing exam is still paper-based because, like I said, we don't want them to be testing purely based on your writing ability. Typically, it's very important to still write with a pen and paper or pencil and paper, which is why, especially when you are that young of an age, that you should be writing on paper as much as you can. So for year 3 and 5, the test order is as follows. First, you'll be doing the writing exam, then you'll be doing the reading exam, and following that, you'll be doing language conventions, including spelling, grammar, and punctuation, and then finally, you'll be doing the numeracy exam in that order. For year 7 and 9, the test order is as follows. You'll be doing the reading exam on day 1, then the writing exam on day 2, language conventions, and then the numeracy exam. An interesting insight is that all students will actually have to complete the reading exam prior to completing the writing exam. This is a big reason why even in other exams as well, you have to do the reading before writing, because they believe that sometimes in the reading exam, you might be able to use some of those words and integrate it in your writing, but it won't show a complete and accurate representation of your writing ability if you're just pulling out some certain words or even some new words you just learnt in the reading test right beforehand. On top of that as well, the test will actually be adaptive testing except writing. So essentially, it will be based on the performance of the actual student as they progress through the exam. So this essentially means the first couple of questions will always be the same across all students, but if you actually get those questions wrong, then the next questions that you actually see, the subsequent questions, will actually be easier, so it'll be a better reflection of your skill level. While if you get the first couple of questions right and you repeatedly get it right, then you get more challenging questions so that you can actually be tested and actually be more stimulated. This is quite important because when I was personally younger and I had to do these NAPLAN exams, especially going into a selective high school like Penrith High School or even Girraween High School, we thought the NAPLAN exam was the most simple thing ever. Our schools didn't actually have to plan for it because our foundations were actually so strong, and most of the time we actually finished a lot earlier compared to the actual exam time that was actually given to us. If the test was 40 minutes, we'll actually only need about 25-30 minutes, and the rest of the time is just double checking and just building on top of what we already did because the questions were just not challenging enough. But since the exams are now online, I think this gives a good opportunity for students who are ahead as well as the students who are falling behind, so they're not discouraged from answering questions later on. So before in the past as well, if you can't even answer the first couple questions, the test also increased in difficulty. But if you can't even answer the first few questions accurately, chances are you probably won't be able to answer the later ones as well if it was that typical older style. So I think this online adaptive style is actually quite useful and provides a lot more stimulus from both ends of the spectrum as well. So in conclusion, I went over the ins and outs of the NAPLAN exam, the history of it, the significance of it, and how this online new NAPLAN system is actually quite useful for both students who are falling a little bit behind and the students who are not really pressured by it in the past. So if you had any questions, feel free to write them down in the comments below. Please like this video. It's very, very useful and helpful for me in terms of the algorithm point of view. And I'll see you next time.